wanted the king's embrace. And if she got that seal of approval, that good housekeeping seal of approval, she would be able to monetize that. She would be able to use that to her advantage. And the palace was very smart on this one.
When the Buckingham Palace day didn't work out for them on their last visit to meet with the king, they, we were supposed to shed a tear for them, Dan, but they actually wound up staying at the estate of Diana's brother.
She flew thousands of miles with her children, only to walk out 47 minutes later with nothing to show for it. No photo, no statement, no deal, and not even the seat at the table she seemed to expect. Every outlet covering the story kept asking what happened inside that room. Megyn Kelly asked a different question, not what happened, but why Meghan was likely to leave empty-handed before she even landed. Kelly did not need palace sources. She had something closer to first-hand insight. She had already sat across from Meghan, interviewed her, and watched how she moved. And what Kelly saw at Highgrove did not look like a family visit that went off track. It looked like a business plan that, in her view, was never likely to work. I don't think for 1 minute she wanted to meet the king to fix the family. It was a business decision. That changes the way people read the whole moment. Today, we are breaking down why Kelly may have been onto something and why the palace may have understood that long before the door ever opened. Let's get into it. Most major outlets covering Highgrove leaned on the same familiar voices, a British royal biographer here, a palace source there, and years of carefully managed opinions delivered from a safe distance. That has been the frame around this whole story, but it has also left out something important. Megyn Kelly is a very different kind of source. She is American, a former attorney, and someone who spent years in high-pressure interviews, reading people in real time without a palace intermediary standing in the middle. That background matters, because it gives her a different lens on what may have been happening behind the scenes, at least according to the way she framed it.
What is the point of marrying a Prince of England if you're not going to get FaceTime with the head royal in the palace? And King Charles, it's always difficult. I think many people can relate to this.
She is not looking at royal figures from a distance. She has actually been in the room with them, and that is the key difference. Kelly has met Meghan, sat across from her at the table, and interviewed her more than once. So when Kelly looks at Highgrove and says she believes she understood what Meghan was really there for, that is not just a catchy opinion. It comes across more like pattern recognition from someone with direct experience, something no British biographer writing about this moment can really claim. That is why Kelly's read feels so different from most of the commentary around this visit. She is not focused on whether the family could heal. She is not getting lost in protocol versus emotion. She goes straight to the practical question, what did Meghan actually need from this trip? And was Highgrove ever likely to provide it? According to the way those signals had been building for months before the visit, the answer may already have been taking shape. Once you look at it that way, Highgrove starts to feel less like a family meeting that went off course and more like the final stop in a much longer chain of events that had been forming well before Meghan's car ever reached Gloucestershire. That is why the online reaction kept splitting in two. Some people saw a family moment that never got the chance to breathe, while others read the whole thing as a calculated move that was never going to produce a warm reunion. And once Kelly's comments entered the mix, the focus shifted even harder toward motive, not emotion. That distinction matters, because it changes how people judge every small detail around the visit. A short meeting, a quiet exit, the lack of a public breakthrough, all of it started getting viewed through a more strategic lens. Instead of asking whether the conversation was tense, viewers began asking whether the real goal was ever personal reconciliation at all. That is where the story gets more complicated, and why Kelly's perspective keeps drawing attention. She was not speaking like someone reacting to a headline from the outside. She was reading the moment like someone who had already seen the style, the timing, and the public messaging at work, and that is exactly why people online kept circling back to her take. The palace had been reading those same signals, and it seems to have already decided what it was willing to put on the table before any arrangement was even set. On the surface, the trip had one public cover story: the Invictus Games countdown in Birmingham. But the real goal, according to the way people have been discussing it, was something much more specific: a photo. Not a peace deal, not a formal reconciliation, just one image of King Charles with Archie and Lilibet, showing a grandfather and his grandchildren together for the first time in years. If that moment had been warm, natural, and shared alongside a statement about family and healing, some commentators believe it could have done more for the Sussex image than any documentary, podcast, interview, or product launch ever did. It would have spread across every platform at once, reshaped the public conversation overnight, and given the kind of attention spike no marketing budget could easily match.
King Charles has officially met Meghan, Harry, Archie, and Lily at Highgrove House, his Gloucestershire country residence.
Kelly, who had watched Meghan across multiple interviews over the years, described the photograph as a kind of good housekeeping seal of approval. In that reading, the picture was not really about a family moment at all. It was an endorsement, and possibly the most valuable thing Meghan could have walked out of Highgrove with. According to the way people have discussed it, the palace seemed to understand that well enough to turn it down without any hesitation. And to see why that refusal mattered so much, you have to look at how badly the brand may have needed that image. Netflix had quietly shifted the originally reported $100 million deal into a first-look arrangement, which many saw as a softer way of saying the partnership had been scaled back. Spotify had also ended its deal, with the explanation tied to productivity concerns rather than a creative disagreement or a mutual parting. As ever, the brand Meghan built to show she did not need the palace had seen website traffic fall by 33% over 4 months, while hundreds of thousands of units were reportedly sitting in a warehouse as expiration dates moved closer. By March 2026, Netflix had dropped the As Ever partnership altogether. Then, in February 2026, Balenciaga announced 11 new ambassadors. Meghan had spent a year attending their shows and positioning herself as a natural fit, but her name was not included. And a daytime Emmy nomination arrived for a show Netflix had already canceled before the nomination was even announced. Not a comeback, more like a consolation prize. The pattern underneath all of this is the part nobody was saying out loud. Every venture seemed to follow the same arc: announcement, early attention, then a quiet slide backward. Netflix, Spotify, Balenciaga, As Ever. That does not read like simple bad luck. It looks more like a deeper structural issue, and the structure people keep pointing back to is the same one. Every commercial opportunity the Sussexes ever had was tied to the titles they held and the institution they stepped away from. The reported $100 million deal did not exist before the wedding. The Spotify deal did not exist. The interest from the fashion house did not exist either. And that is exactly why the online conversation kept circling back to the same point. The palace was not just weighing a family visit, it was judging value. If the discussion around Highgrove felt cold, it was because people online believed the real question was never whether the meeting could happen, but whether it could be turned into something useful. That is also why Kelly's take hit so hard. She was not framing it as a wounded reunion or a simple misunderstanding. She was suggesting the visit may have been viewed as leverage from the start. In that light, every detail starts to look different. The quick exit, the lack of a public moment, and the silence afterward. What some saw as disappointment, others read as a sign that the expected payoff never materialized. And once that interpretation took hold, the reaction spread fast. Supporters pushed back and said people were making too much of one short meeting, while critics argued the pattern was hard to ignore. The debate was not just about one trip anymore, it was about whether the Sussexes have been able to turn personal appearances into public momentum, or whether that era may have already passed. That is where the tension builds, because the same image that might have changed the conversation did not appear, and without it, the entire visit was left to be judged by the gap between expectation and reality. Some online commentators saw that as proof the palace knew exactly what was being sought. Others said it simply showed how much was riding on a moment that never became official.
Meghan is furious. What does that mean? Why is she furious?
Well, Meghan is furious because she hasn't done everything she wanted. When they knew they were going to come to the UK and London, she sent a list of what she wanted done.
The lifestyle brand with the royal adjacent name likely would not have sold a single unit before the wedding. And the way people have been discussing it online, every door that opened, every deal that followed, and every platform that gave it attention came downstream of one decision made in Windsor in May 2018. Once that decision stopped carrying the same commercial weight, Highgrove was seen by some as the most direct route to trying to rebuild it. One well-timed image could have reintroduced the one thing every shaky venture had been quietly trying to replace, proof that the Sussex name still had a living link to the British royal family. The palace, according to that same line of commentary, seemed to understand the numbers just as clearly as people in Los Angeles did. It had watched the Netflix downgrade, the Spotify exit, the Balenciaga slight, and the warehouse situation, and it likely knew exactly what that photograph might mean for As Ever's numbers, for the Sussex brand's ability to get meetings, and for Meghan's commercial visibility. So the answer was no. No image, no statement. The confirmation that the meeting even happened was kept as minimal as the palace could make it. Nothing easy to clip, nothing simple to share, nothing that could be shaped into a bigger narrative. Not a frame to monetize, not a quote to build around. The brand built to show she did not need royalty arrived at Highgrove, and online commentary saw it as asking royalty for help. The palace, in effect, answered by leaving them with nothing to take home. But the refusal of the photograph was not where that answer began. According to the way this moment has been discussed, it started much earlier, not through a press office, but through a postcode. Before anyone spoke inside Highgrove, before the car rolled through the gate, before those 47 minutes even began, the palace had already made its position clear, not by a spokesperson, but by an address. Meghan had sent ahead a list of things she wanted arranged at Buckingham Palace, with specific requests submitted in advance, almost as if the details were already settled and only the follow-through remained. She got none of it. Not the palace setting, not the preparations, not a single item from that list. Instead, the meeting shifted to Highgrove, and most coverage treated the location as just a logistical footnote. Kelly noticed something others seemed to miss. The location was not a small detail. In her view, it was the first move in a carefully controlled sequence, and every possible address sent a different message.
Did King Charles make a mistake inviting the Montecito freak show into Highgrove House? Because we did have confirmation on Friday that King Charles and Queen Camila had met with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle.
The palace seemed to choose each location very deliberately. Buckingham Palace is the seat of the monarchy, so turning up there is not just a family visit, it is a public signal. The images that come from those gates carry a kind of weight no other address in Britain can really match. Simply arriving at Buckingham Palace says something before anyone says a word. Clarence House is different, but it still carries real significance. A working royal residence suggests closeness, forward movement, and a connection to the future that is still worth acknowledging. It places you inside the royal structure, not at the center, but close enough to matter. Highgrove is something else entirely. It is Charles's private home, hours outside London, and that distinction matters in the way people have been discussing it online. It is not state-owned, it is personally owned. There is no institutional weight there, no ceremonial meaning attached to the address itself. It is a house in Gloucestershire where Charles keeps his gardens and his private life separate from the public side of the monarchy. If the palace had wanted to suggest genuine movement, the location would have done that work before any photo was ever taken. Arrival photos, departure photos, a warm line about the family coming together. That is the kind of thing the palace communications system is built for when it wants the public to notice. None of that happened here. There was no arrival incident, no departure incident, and no especially warm statement. The confirmation that the meeting took place was kept to the bare minimum, just enough to acknowledge it, while saying as little as possible. And that is why the reaction online kept getting louder. People were not just looking at a missed photo opportunity, they were reading the whole setup as a message, one that said access was limited and the optics were being tightly controlled. In that kind of environment, even silence starts to feel intentional. Some viewers argued that the palace was simply being cautious and avoiding unnecessary drama, while others believed the low-key handling itself was the point. No glossy arrival incident, no polished departure image, no line that could be turned into a public relations win, just a brief acknowledgement and nothing more. For commentators watching closely, that restraint said as much as any statement could have. That is also why the location talk mattered so much. Once people started comparing Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Highgrove, the meeting stopped looking like a simple family catch-up and started looking like a carefully placed decision. Each address carried its own meaning, An online discussion focused on what it meant when the most visible option was not the one chosen. To supporters, the whole thing was being overread. To critics, it looked like the palace understood exactly how much value a single image could carry and decided not to hand it over. That divide is what kept the story alive, because the more minimal the official response became, the more people online tried to fill in the blanks. Highgrove was not chosen for convenience. It was chosen because it sent a very specific message. Private, controlled, and not a sign that anything meaningful was shifting. Even the arrival seemed to underline that point. Their car came through the estate gates mixed in with the traffic from a Chanel luncheon taking place on the grounds that afternoon. There was no announcement, no cameras, and no arrival moment that could be captured and passed around online. It did not feel like family simply returning home. It looked more like people who had been given a tight window and knew they could not afford to waste it, slipping past someone else's event just to reach a gate that might not stay open for long. That same afternoon, 50 miles north,
Now, there were no photographs, no TV cameras, and virtually no details. So what do we know about what happened behind the gates at Highgrove?
Harry was in Birmingham for the Invictus Countdown event, where he was seen playing pickleball and told ITV that his family was proud of him. So there were really two different agendas unfolding at the same time, in two different cities. On camera, the public reason for the trip was playing out in Birmingham. Behind closed gates in Gloucestershire, the other reason was unfolding with no cameras anywhere near it. One was the version they wanted people to focus on. The other, according to the way this has been discussed online, was the part that mattered most. The address attached to each setting made it pretty clear which one the palace was prepared to acknowledge publicly, and which one it would only allow on its own terms, in its own space, and on its own timeline. What happened behind those gates made even that carefully chosen location feel unusually generous. For weeks, the story had seemed simple. Harry was coming alone. The Invictus Countdown in Birmingham, held 12 months ahead of the 2027 competition, was scheduled, official, and tightly controlled. It gave Harry a reason to be on British soil without making it look like he was trying to return to the family he had spent years publicly criticizing. Meghan was said to be staying in Montecito with no taxpayer-funded security approved for her or the young people, and no arrangements apparently in place for her to join the trip. At that point, it seemed like she was not coming at all. Then, almost overnight, everything shifted. And according to online discussion, it did not look like a family impulse or some sudden emotional reset after years of distance. The bigger change was the commercial picture, and by the time the trip was announced, that picture had become something that could not be handled from California without a major move. The Invictus Games, the project Harry built entirely outside the palace, the one that was meant to show he could create something meaningful on his own terms, was reportedly about £25 million short of its funding target. With less than a year left before the opening ceremony in Birmingham, the event that had been Harry's strongest argument for an independent legacy was facing a serious gap right when it needed to show momentum. But the funding shortfall was only one layer of a much harder week. Highgrove did not happen in a vacuum. It was the most visible part of a rescue effort running on several fronts at once, and the 7 days around it tell a story that the visit itself seemed designed to cover. Before flying to London, the whole situation was already being watched closely because every move seemed to carry two meanings at once. On the surface, it was just another tightly managed trip, but online, people kept reading it as a test of leverage, timing, and who held the stronger hand behind the scenes. That is why the reaction did not fade. The more controlled the public details became, the more attention shifted to what was not being said. Commentators kept circling the same point. If this was meant to look personal, why did it keep feeling so strategic? And if it was strategic, then the quiet handling suddenly made a lot more sense. For critics, the silence looked deliberate. For supporters, it was simply the palace refusing to be dragged into a bigger spectacle. Either way, the discussion kept growing because the trip was no longer just about one meeting or one visit. It had become a wider story about access, image, and the limits of what could actually be achieved when every step was under a microscope.
King Charles has met with Meghan Markle and his grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, for the first time in 4 years. Taking place in the English countryside, Prince Harry and his father put their differences aside
According to the way this was discussed online, Harry also made a stop at Sir Elton John's home in the south of France. The visit was not being framed as a casual catch-up, but as a conversation with a very specific goal, asking for money to help close the Invictus funding gap while the Birmingham deadline kept getting closer. John had already been publicly aligned with the Sussexes. He had stood with them before, and he had also been tied into the same legal action against a major British newspaper, a case that stretched on for years, generated huge costs, and ultimately ended in a loss. The response Harry reportedly received in the south of France has since become one of the quietest and most striking details in the entire story. Those close to the matter say John's frustration came through in just 4 words, delivered without much warmth. "I am not an ATM." That setback came 2 days before Highgrove, on July 8th, when the privacy case against Associated Newspapers was decided. Harry had pursued that case alongside John and 5 other claimants. Out of 400 pages, 97 claims were dismissed. The judge's finding was blunt, saying the evidence did not hold up. The court also said there appeared to be a legitimate, possible, lawful source for the information the claimants had spent years and significant money arguing was obtained unlawfully. And the financial hit was heavy, with legal costs on the other side estimated between 34 and 50 million pounds. Coverage around the case was still uncertain because the judge's own wording about claims that may never have needed to reach court gave insurers a documented reason to step back, which could leave a significant share of those costs potentially on Harry personally. The court loss came on Tuesday. The conversation in the south of France happened before that. Highgrove followed on Thursday. All of it landed inside the same 7-day stretch, and that is why it did not read like a simple family visit with a bit of legal noise in the background. It looked more like a crisis week, with a family visit running right through the middle of it.
It's the royal reconciliation the world has been waiting for. The King and Queen, Harry and Meghan, and their children. The special moment, 4 years in the making, unfolding at Charles's private country residence.
Serving a purpose that had nothing to do with family. The palace, by the way this has been discussed, seemed to have the full picture before the visit was even arranged. The court loss, the funding gap, the brand problems, the closed doors, the south of France, all of it was already part of the backdrop. It appeared to understand just how cornered the Sussexes were, and, according to the same online chatter, it had already decided before that gate opened how little it was prepared to offer. So when Harry and Meghan arrived at Highgrove, neither side seemed shocked by the other. It was always going to be one side urgently seeking something, and the other side quietly drawing the line before the first cup of tea was even poured. We have already gone through why Kelly's read hits harder, the photo that may have mattered more than any deal, the address that seemed to reveal the palace's answer before anyone sat down, and just how boxed in Harry and Meghan seemed walking through that gate. Now we get to the part most channels skipped over. What actually happened in that room? That is where the whole story gets even more interesting, because the room itself became part of the mystery. When people online started picking apart the timeline, they were not just looking at who showed up, they were looking at what could realistically be said in such a short visit, and what could not be fixed in less than an hour. Some viewers said the brief window made the meeting feel less like a warm family moment and more like a carefully managed exchange with very limited room to move. Others pushed back, saying the palace was always unlikely to turn it into a spectacle. Either way, the silence afterward only made the reaction louder. That is why the 47 minutes mattered so much in the public conversation. It was not just about time on a clock, it was about the message people thought that time sent. To some, it suggested a firm boundary. To others, it looked like a conversation that never had much chance of changing anything in the first place. And once that interpretation took hold, every small detail around the visit started to feel loaded, which is exactly why the room itself became the center of attention. Who was actually in that room, and what move did Charles make that was so quiet, so precise, that Meghan never seemed to see it coming? The meeting lasted 47 minutes. After everything that had built up around it, the years of public tension, the books, the documentaries, the legal fights, and the young children not having been in the same room as their grandfather since June 2022, 47 minutes really is not much. It is shorter than most work meetings, shorter than a therapy session, even shorter than the drive from London to Gloucestershire. and every minute, according to the way people have discussed it, felt controlled. From the moment the door opened, the whole thing came across as formal and tightly managed, not the kind of easy reunion you might expect from a family that had not been together in years. More like a meeting between two sides who had already read each other's briefs and knew exactly what was likely to come next. No warmth building as the minutes passed, no old familiarity breaking through, just two sides, one room, one clock, no meal, and no photographs.
In some ways, this was a stunning turn of events. At first, it seemed security concerns might keep Harry, Meghan, and the kids away, but since he split with the family, Harry has had a rocky relationship with his father.
The conditions from the very beginning were completely set. Nothing on social media, nothing leaked out, no detailed account of what was discussed, and only a very minimal confirmation afterward that a meeting had taken place. The shape of the encounter had already been decided long before the car even pulled through the gate. And then there is one detail that changes the way people read everything else that may have happened in that room. Queen Camila was there, not somewhere nearby, not tucked into another part of the property, but in the room from the start. That may sound like a small logistical point, but it was not. Camila does not usually stay at Highgrove. She has her own home at Ray Mill in Wiltshire, and by most accounts, she prefers it. She is not a regular fixture there in the way Charles is. So her presence at this particular meeting, on this particular afternoon, looks like a deliberate choice that may have been made ahead of time. Royal biographer Sally Bedell Smith has said what role Camila played, the same role she reportedly served during Harry and Charles's private meeting in February 2024. Not as a participant, but as a witness. That meant everything said in that room had an independent observer who could later confirm, if needed, what was and was not said, what was and was not promised, and what was and was not agreed upon. When you need a witness present at a meeting with your own son, the whole relationship has clearly shifted categories. It is no longer being treated like a private family conversation between people who trust each other. It starts to look more like a managed encounter between two sides, with one of them taking institutional precautions over how the moment might later be described. Harry reportedly went in first, Meghan stayed outside with the children, so there was no united front being presented at the door. By the way this has been discussed, the palace seemed ready to speak with Harry alone, not with Harry and Meghan as a pair. That quiet structural detail, who was inside and who was not, said a lot about how the palace appears to have framed the visit from the start. And that is why people kept reading so much into the setup, because once a meeting starts feeling this controlled, even the smallest detail can take on a bigger meaning. Online, some viewers argued that the arrangement suggested the palace wanted clear boundaries, while others said it simply reflected caution after years of public tension and scrutiny. Either way, the reaction did not come from nowhere. When there is no photo, no full account, and no easy story to point to, people start filling in the blanks on their own. That is exactly what happened here. The silence after the visit gave the discussion more room to grow, and every new interpretation seemed to circle back to the same idea. This was not being treated like a normal family catch-up. Instead, it was being read as something far more measured, almost transactional in the eyes of critics and commentators. The presence of a witness, the split arrival, and the lack of any public detail all pushed the conversation in that direction. And once that happened, the question was no longer whether the meeting happened, it was what the setup itself was meant to communicate.
Is they believe that Harry and Meghan were actually summoned, not so much invited. Now, I think that might be an interesting theory. This was a summit meeting.
To see those grandchildren, Kelly, drawing on years of personal reporting, describes him as a decent man, someone whose genuine warmth can be used against him by people who know exactly where to press. And that detail matters here because Harry knows his father. He knows every button, every pressure point, from a lifetime of watching him navigate duty and family under pressure. Bringing Archie and Lilibet to Highgrove, as people have discussed it, was seen by some as the strongest card in the hand, and it was used very deliberately. Charles appears to have seen that immediately, and he handled it in a way that let him show up as a grandfather while still giving the institution room to keep control. The warmth was real. The outcome was controlled. Both things can be true across all 47 minutes. The approach did not require a confrontation or any dramatic speech, and it never needed the tension to spill out into the open. As Kelly noted from watching the royal family operate up close, nobody does that balancing act better. It is like cotton candy. They just talk, and they do not say much at all. Charles did not need to refuse anything directly. No hard line, no public lecture about trust issues. He only had to sit there as a grandfather over tea, warm enough to remain civil with his son without turning it into a fight, and careful enough to take away the one card Harry might have used later in public. My father shut the door. My father won't see his grandchildren, and by opening the door just enough, that card seems to have vanished, leaving Meghan with nothing she could really use. No promise, no clear signal, no moment she could later point to as a turning point, and nothing that could be turned into a story about the Sussex comeback beginning. The strongest thing that happened across those 47 minutes was not a refusal and not a confrontation. It was a carefully managed nothing. Cotton candy with full institutional precision. So when the door opened again and Meghan stepped back into the Gloucestershire afternoon, that was exactly what she seemed to carry with her. And when Meghan left Highgrove, the missing photograph was only the most obvious absence. It was not the only one. There was no security arrangement, no stay at Buckingham Palace, no public appearance with the king, no restoration of royal standing, no agreement about future UK visits, and no statement beyond the bare minimum confirmation that a meeting had taken place. The palace, in effect, gave the press almost nothing to work with.
When it comes to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, saying that it is absolutely essential that they do have no future role in the British royal family.
And Meghan, by comparison, was seen far less. She skipped every public appearance during the entire UK visit, with no events, no engagements, and no street-level moment that would test whether public reaction had softened since her last time on British soil. According to the way people have discussed it online, she may have had little interest in facing whatever was waiting outside, because it apparently was not what she had hoped to find. The woman who flew in with hopes of reinforcing her royal link spent the trip largely out of sight of the British public she was supposedly reconnecting with. That brand refresh, as critics put it, had nowhere to land. About 50 miles away that same afternoon, William and Catherine were at a charity polo event in Windsor, photographed together, relaxed, and not having to manage the mood of the moment or wait on any gate decision. They were not hoping for a released image to prove they still belonged. They simply showed up, did what working royals do, and let the cameras catch the rest. The contrast between that and what was unfolding in Gloucestershire was hard to miss. One side has spent years building something through steady work, while the other appears to have been trying to borrow a single moment to stand in for it. One side did not need a photograph, the other had built an entire transatlantic trip around one. That gap is exactly why the online reaction kept growing, because people were not reacting to one photo or one sentence, they were reacting to the whole shape of the visit. When a meeting leaves behind so little to point to, viewers start reading into the silence itself, and that is where the speculation took on a life of its own. Some commentators said the carefully limited setup made the encounter feel less like a personal repair attempt and more like a tightly managed public moment. Others pushed back and said that after years of tension, caution would have been expected on all sides. But either way, the lack of visible warmth, the lack of follow-up detail, and the lack of any clear next step all left the public with the same uneasy question: what was really achieved here? That question matters because it shifts the focus away from emotion and towards strategy. In the way people discussed it online, every small choice, who arrived when, who was seen, who was not, and what was left unsaid, became part of the larger picture. The meeting may have happened behind closed doors, but the reaction outside those doors was driven by what was missing just as much as by what was present. And that is why the conversation did not end when Meghan left Gloucestershire. It only moved into a new phase, with viewers now comparing the controlled silence around Highgrove to the more public, more polished image others were able to project that same day. For critics, that contrast said plenty. The wall nobody is saying out loud may be the most important part of this whole situation. Charles meeting Harry clearly carries weight as a father and son moment, but structurally, it changes very little, because the one person whose position really shapes where this goes was not at Highgrove, was not in Gloucestershire, and made that stance clear through his absence. William reportedly has not spoken to his brother since the Queen's funeral in September 2022, and by most accounts, he was not exactly pleased that the Highgrove meeting took place. The institution does not really move without William. Charles can open a door, but William controls what waits on the other side, and that wall does not shift because of a 47-minute meeting at a private residence, carefully managed, closely observed, and left without a single photograph.
Force Prince William into a reunion that he doesn't want with Prince Harry. And that means if he doesn't go down that path, everyone can say, oh, he's the evil brother.
William and Catherine have spent years building their public image in a steady, low-drama way, and that kind of momentum does not disappear because Charles agrees to a meeting, opens a gate, or serves a cup of tea. Highgrove may have created headlines, but it does not shift where William stands. There is also one more thing Meghan left without, and unlike the missing photograph or the security arrangement, this one was already in motion 2 days before she ever reached the gate. On July 8th came the ruling in Harry's privacy case against Associated Newspapers, and it landed hard, with 400 pages and 97 claims dismissed. The judge's conclusion was unusually direct, saying the evidence was not credible and that there was a legitimate, possible lawful source for the information the claimants had spent years and a huge amount of money arguing was obtained unlawfully. The legal costs on the other side were said to be somewhere between 34 and 50 million pounds. Whether insurance covers any of that is still unclear, because the judge's comments about claims that should never have made it to court may give insurers a documented reason to step back, which could leave Harry facing a substantial personal bill. Court loss on Tuesday, Highgrove on Thursday. The legal setback came first, then the family visit followed 2 days later. Read that sequence together, and the whole week starts to look different. It was not a family milestone with a little legal static in the background. It looked more like a pressure-packed 7 days, with a 47-minute meeting at a private estate becoming the last possible move on a board that was quickly running out of space. It came back empty on every front at the same time. Most of the coverage around this story has been careful not to spell out what the numbers seem to suggest. Montecito is far from cheap, with the yearly cost said to be around $6 million, and roughly $3 million of that tied to private security alone. According to the way this has been discussed, that was supposed to be temporary when they stepped back in 2020, and that is exactly why people kept circling back to the same point, because the visit was never being judged as just one afternoon at Highgrove. In the way online discussion framed it, the meeting sat inside a much bigger picture, one where legal pressure, public image, and family distance all seemed to be moving at the same time. That is what made the silence around it feel so loud. For some viewers, the absence of a clear outcome suggested there was very little room left to bargain with. For others, it was another example of how carefully every detail is now being managed, right down to what is seen and what is left unsaid. Either way, the reaction kept growing because the public was not looking at a single event anymore, it was looking at a pattern. And once people started reading the pattern that way, every new development seemed to fit into the same uneasy story, one that left more questions than answers.
Took place at Highgrove House, according to Buckingham Palace. But it's interesting, we don't have any photographs.
No.
I wonder why that is.
I think that's very deliberate. I see this whole meeting less a family reunion and more of a test.
What was presented as a temporary arrangement while they got settled has now stretched into 5 years. Once you factor in the mortgage on a $14.5 million property, staff, travel, and the legal expenses from a case that ended in defeat, the picture starts to look very different. What is left is a burn rate that really depends on steady income, and that income is no longer coming in at the level it once did. People who follow the Sussex finances have estimated a window of about 18 to 36 months before real pressure starts to show, if nothing changes on the income side. That is not the kind of forecast anyone wants hanging in the background, and according to the way this has been discussed, that clock was already ticking before the court ruling, before the south of France, and before Highgrove opened and shut 47 minutes later with nothing resolved. Still, the money situation, serious as it is, may not be the most structurally important issue in play. That may belong to something in the British Parliament that almost nobody has tied directly to Highgrove, even though the connection changes how those 47 minutes are being interpreted at the deepest level. The Removal of Titles Bill, introduced by MP Rachel Maskell, was written broadly enough to apply to any member of the royal family who is not actively carrying out royal duties. It still has not passed. Most private members' bills never make it to a final vote, but this one is still alive, and the discussion around it has shifted in a way that is hard to ignore. A big reason for that shift is Andrew. In 2025, Charles moved against his own brother, and by every public impression, Charles is someone who tends to avoid confrontation and finds open conflict deeply uncomfortable, yet he acted anyway. The message was pretty clear. Titles are not lifetime rewards just for past service. They are tied to current responsibility. Once that responsibility goes, the title can go with it. Commentators who spent years saying the removal of Harry and Meghan's titles would be constitutionally difficult and practically unlikely have started using very different language. So now the real question is no longer whether it can happen. It is what would have to happen for it to become unavoidable for Harry and Meghan.
Of when, not if, he strips Prince Harry and Meghan Markle of their royal titles, but they're not going to be the only one.
That is not some abstract parliamentary process happening quietly in the background. It is a very real pressure point on the one thing their entire public identity still leans on. Every profile that uses the Duchess of Sussex title, every brand story built around the Sussex name, every commercial deal that still benefits from the remaining link to British royalty, it all traces back to titles they keep, but no longer appear to rely on through active royal duty. Those are titles they stepped away from in January 2020, and there has been no clear sign they intend to return to that role. Charles, by most public accounts, acts when the institution needs it, even when it involves family, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it creates headlines he would probably rather avoid. The logic people applied to Andrew does not automatically stop with Harry. If anything, years of public criticism, the interviews, the documentary, and the memoir have, in some commentators' view, made the case for action feel more plausible, not less. If those titles were removed, the Sussex brand would not just take a hit and move on. It would lose the very thing that separates it from any other celebrity lifestyle company operating out of a California home. Without the titles, the Sussex name would simply belong to two people the British public watched step away from royal obligations, then continue building a business around the association they had publicly rejected. That is why the reaction around Highgrove did not stay focused on one short visit for long. Online discussions quickly moved from the meeting itself to what it seemed to represent, especially once people started connecting it to the larger pressure points already hanging over the Sussexes. In that kind of environment, even a brief, quiet encounter can take on a much bigger meaning than anyone inside the room may have intended. And that is where the tension really sits. On one side, there is the image of a family trying to manage distance, appearances, and private conflict. On the other side, there is the public reality of titles, branding, financial strain, and the constant question of how much value remains in the royal link. When those two worlds collide, every move gets picked apart, and every silence starts to look deliberate. That is also why some viewers kept returning to the idea that the real story was not whether a meeting happened, but what the outcome suggested. A short visit with no clear result can be read in very different ways depending on where someone stands. Supporters may see caution and privacy, critics may see a missed opportunity, or a sign that the room was never built for the kind of resolution people hoped for. The claim remains disputed online, but the reaction itself shows how little room there is left for neutral interpretation. So the focus shifts again, not just to the personal side of the story, but to the wider pressure surrounding it. When public image, legal uncertainty, and title questions are all sitting in the background at once, even a 47-minute meeting can feel loaded with meaning. And that is exactly why this story is still being talked about long after the door closed. Highgrove was supposed to interrupt that pattern. The photo was expected to revive the living link between the Sussex brand and the royal family, at least in the eyes of supporters and critics watching closely. The visit was also meant to project enough goodwill to ease the parliamentary conversation, soften the institutional mood, and buy some breathing room to find a commercial path that did not lean so heavily on titles that were starting to feel conditional. Instead, it became 47 minutes of carefully managed silence, and almost nothing changed. The financial clock, the parliamentary clock, and the brand survival clock all seemed to keep moving exactly as they had before the car reached the gates. Charles had not been in the same room as Archie and Lilibet since the Platinum Jubilee in June 2022, more than 4 years. A grandfather who had made phone calls and joined video calls.
Buckingham Palace, the spiritual home of the British monarchy, to the two most hated people connected to the British royal family, in Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, is a mistake. And Clive Alderton knew it was a mistake.
But in any real sense, he had never truly known his grandchildren. 2 young children growing up in Montecito who recognized his face on a screen, but not in everyday life, not through the ordinary, close contact that turns a distant image into someone you actually know. By most accounts, Charles was aware of that gap, and not just on a surface level. People who have known him for years describe him as someone whose warmth is genuine and whose sensitivity can make him especially reachable when family matters are involved. He wanted to see those children. Harry, according to the way some commentators read the situation, understood that perfectly because he grew up seeing how that emotional pressure worked and where it could be applied. Bringing Archie and Lilibet to Highgrove was the strongest card in the hand. Not Invictus, not the legal situation, not the financial picture. The grandchildren, a grandfather who had not held them in 4 years while dealing with a cancer diagnosis, and someone who, by nature, seems to find family separation deeply painful. That was the leverage, at least in the way the moment is being discussed online. Charles appeared to recognize it, and then he did something that took more discipline than simply declining the visit. He showed up as a grandfather, gave the afternoon what it needed on a human level, and gave the institution away on nothing. The warmth was real, and the outcome was tightly controlled. For all 47 of those minutes, both things seemed to be true at once. What Archie and Lilibet may have taken from that afternoon, we cannot know. What is clear, at least from the way people are discussing it online, is that Tyler Perry, their celebrity godfather, has reportedly been a more steady presence in their everyday lives than the grandfather who also happens to be King of England. They know Charles through video calls stretched across years of institutional tension. They know Perry through closeness and consistency, the kind of ordinary access that builds real familiarity instead of a ceremonial connection. That detail is already uncomfortable, and it becomes even more striking when you place it beside something Kelly noticed. One quiet point that seems to explain the structure of this whole story better than most palace sources or royal biographers have managed. That contrast is exactly why the reaction online keeps sticking. People are not just reacting to one quiet afternoon at Highgrove, they are reacting to what it seemed to confirm about the larger distance between image and reality. On one side, there is the polished public story, and on the other, there is the much messier personal one, where every gesture gets weighed for meaning and every silence gets treated like a signal. And once that kind of reading takes hold, it becomes hard to undo. Supporters may frame the visit as a small step, a private moment, or simple caution. Critics, meanwhile, see a meeting that was never going to solve the deeper problems hanging over the family and the brand. Neither side can prove the full story from the outside, but the dispute itself has become part of the story. That is what makes Kelly's point linger. It was not just about who met whom, it was about what the situation was always likely to produce. If the room was built around careful limits, then the emptiness afterward was not an accident to some viewers, it was the result they expected all along. And that is where the next layer of this story starts to matter.
He wanted one-to-one time with his father. He didn't get it the last time. Each and every time Harry has appeared, the Queen Consort is there.
Because there is another grandfather in this story, one without a palace, a title, or an institution standing behind him. No crown, no estate, no commercial value, and no real closeness to power. This is someone who raised a daughter, walked her partway down the aisle toward a prince, and, by most accounts, has not spoken to her in years. Thomas Markle lives alone. He has grandchildren he has never met, and the phone, as people have noted online, does not seem to ring. Kelly summed up that contrast in 4 words: because he doesn't wear a crown. That line gets at the thread running under every visit, every negotiation, every carefully managed meeting, and every commercial calculation in this whole story. It all comes back to proximity to power, what it is worth, and what people think it can be turned into. Charles, for 47 minutes, had managed access to grandchildren he barely knows, because that access still carried value in the eyes of the people shaping the moment. Thomas Markle, meanwhile, is in a house in Mexico waiting for a call that, based on every available account, does not seem likely to come because what he offers appears to carry no value to a brand already under pressure. The difference has little to do with love, history, or old wounds. According to the way this is being discussed online, it is really about what proximity to each man is commercially worth, and what a photo with either one does for a brand that has already seen a 33% traffic decline. One wears a crown, the other does not. The math, to many viewers, is that simple. And Highgrove, the 47 minutes, the cotton candy, the witness in the room, the missing photo, and the flight back to California with nothing to show for it, all of that became the moment that calculation stopped feeling deniable. The institution did not have to win. It only had to stay in place and let the numbers speak for themselves. In the view of many commentators, that is exactly what happened. 3 things will show where this goes, and none of them are really family moments. Each one is a business event. The first thing people are watching is whether Charles attends the Invictus Games opening in Birmingham in July 2027. Harry has described that moment as a dream, with his father beside him in front of the world, seemingly giving added weight to everything Invictus is meant to stand for.
Prince Harry is so keen for his children to spend some time with their grandfather. We know that the king would love to spend some time with his grandchildren.
If Charles does appear, then Highgrove will have meant something after all. If he does not, those 47 minutes may have been exactly what the palace intended them to be, a tightly managed appearance with a controlled exit and no second act. Not a real thaw, just a formal moment dressed up like family time. Keep an eye on the removal of titles bill as it moves through Parliament. The Andrew precedent did more than change the conversation. It also showed that Charles can move when the institution needs him to, even if the personal cost is said to be steep. If that bill starts to gain real momentum, the Sussex brand could face a question it may not have a clean answer for. Not a rough stretch, not just a branding issue, but something much deeper. What is the name actually worth once the titles supporting it are gone? Watch the numbers through the end of 2026. The early 2026 figures were not exactly suggesting long-term stability. If the brand settles, then the runway opens a little and future decisions can be made from firmer ground. If it weakens further, and the inventory issue, the traffic drop, and the loss of the Netflix partnership all keep pointing the same way, then whatever comes next may not feel optional. It may feel forced. The institution has outlasted challenge after challenge for centuries, not through cruelty or spite, and not by staging campaigns or manufacturing embarrassment. It did it by keeping control of the frame, even when the conversation around it turned messy. That is why so many people keep circling back to Highgrove, not as a warm family moment, but as a carefully managed scene that meant different things to different viewers. For supporters, it was restraint. For critics, it was proof that the gap between public image and private reality is still doing most of the talking. And that gap is exactly what keeps this story alive online. Once people start reading every gesture as strategy, every silence starts to look planned, and every small appearance gets pulled apart for clues. That does not mean the full picture is visible from the outside, only that the reaction itself has become part of the pressure surrounding it. So the next steps matter less because they are sentimental, and more because they will show whether this is still just a passing headline or something with real consequences attached. Across every reign, every scandal, every public crisis, and every attempt to bend it to someone else's needs, the institution has kept one thing the same. It refuses to change its core for anyone, no matter who they are, what they once represented, or how urgently they want it to move. Meghan did not really lose those 47 minutes in that room. She lost them the moment she treated the trip like a negotiation, because the institution she was dealing with has spent centuries not accepting terms that are not its own. Kelly seemed to understand that before the plane even landed. The palace, in its own way, seemed to confirm it before the gate ever opened. Highgrove delivered the answer without a photo, without a statement, and without a single word either side would need to take back. Is there any version of this where Harry and Meghan end up with something stable? Not royal duties, not HRH, not a balcony wave, just something sustainable that does not require the institution to keep bending toward them. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. Not subscribed yet? If this Highgrove moment, the title talk, and the Invictus timeline have you paying attention, like, subscribe, share, and comment so you stay with the story. And see you on the next one.